Short questions, short answers by Torah Teacher Ariel and eBible. Copyright Tetze Torah Ministries, 2015, all rights reserved. Here's our question for tonight. Why do many worship and do Sabbath on Sunday instead of Saturday? So let's continue talking about this Sabbath type question. FYI, eBible.com actually has two similarly worded Romans 14:5 Sabbath questions on their site. The other one specifically asking, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? The answer we will study tonight represents but one of those two similarly worded Romans 14:5 questions. So you're going to see verbiage related to, are we free to worship God? Things like that. Romans 14:5 reads, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Is Romans 14:5 a Sabbath verse? Well, let's exegete and find out. All still photography used in this video is courtesy of Unsplash.com. In one sense, believers are free to worship God any day of the week, and we should be worshiping Him every day of the week, right? However, our Messianic freedom should not separate us, but cause us to, quote, pursue what makes for mutual upbuilding, end quote. That's Romans 14:19. I'm going to pull a lot of quotes from the same chapter, which is Romans 14. I highly encourage you to read the chapter as a whole. Sunday keepers often turn to Romans 14:5 in support of choosing one day over another. I personally don't believe that this verse allows for such a reading. So let me go through and explain why I don't. I can say that I've studied many varied commentaries on this passage to include Calvin, Murray, Dunn, Lloyd-Jones, Bruce, Barth, Hendrickson, Stuhlmacher, Cranfield, Nanos, Haig, MacArthur, Stern, Lancaster, Janicki, and some others that I have here on my computer. And in my estimation as a Bible student, Romans 14:5 does not seem like a likely passage teaching freedom from Sabbath worship, viz. It's not a Sabbath versus Sunday passage at all, even though many people interpret it that way because Paul uses the phrase one man esteems one day. I feel that the best way to interpret verse 5 is within the larger context, that is, the entire chapter stands together as a whole. And that would make it a verse about voluntary fast days. And I base my position on a number of historical and textual clues. So let's go through some of those clues. Number one, the Sabbath is God's covenant sign to Israel, per Exodus 31:13 and Ezekiel 20, verse 12. The Gentiles grafted into remnant Israel would have had natural association with seventh-day Sabbath worship, read Acts 14:1 and Acts 15:21. Do you understand the impact of that? That's the history of the passage. At the time the book of Romans was written, which was around 55 to 56 CE, official, quote, Sabbath versus Sunday, end quote, debates were not extant. They didn't exist. Sunday would not become the established Christian day of worship until a few hundred years later. So really, we shouldn't be pushing Sunday into this passage at all. It's kind of anachronistic. For Paul to casually recommend in one verse the personal choice to give up seventh-day Sabbath in favor of Sunday worship seems highly unlikely given the weight of received Torah passages like Exodus 31:16 and 17, and the establishment of Sabbath in the Jewish communities, of which the sect known as the Way was a part. Read Acts 24:14. Did you understand what I'm saying here? The Gentiles were part of the Jewish community, and Sabbath was already established in the Jewish community. Thousands of Jews believed in Yeshua by the first century, and many were zealous for the Torah. Read Acts 21:20. And this makes a purported, quote, personal allowance to switch from Sabbath to Sunday worship via this verse, end quote, a virtual historical improbability. That's the way I see it. In my estimation, if the verse in question were truly about Sabbath versus Sunday, then a number of problematic details begin to arise. So let's keep going on this particular theme. For instance, to leave the decision in the hands of those who are, quote, fully convinced in their own mind, end quote, appears to be a weak way to establish congregational bylaws for a leader the likes of Paul. You'd have to agree with me, right? Now, listen to this. These are some very important questions that we need to ask about first century. Jewish and Gentile believers are to rejoice together. We already know that's true per Romans 15:10. But let's ask these questions. How could the newly emerging Messianic communities maintain any unity and group cohesion, per Ephesians 4:13, if we had some folks choosing Sabbath and others choosing Sunday? How could genuine fellowship form in such a setting? And what if the majority is, quote, convinced, end quote, that Sabbath is correct? Should those, quote, unconvinced, end quote, leave and go elsewhere? Or should they ignore their conscience, stay, and yield to the majority vote? See what I'm saying? These are some very important questions that we need to start asking ourselves from a first century perspective, where Jews and Gentiles were worshiping together and Paul was wanting them to continue to rejoice together as a group. Was he really just leaving it up to some individuals to make votes? Well, what are our conclusions for tonight's short study? Let's take a look. The early Messianic communities were a sect of Judaism. Read Acts 24:14. Even a surface-level examination of the chapter will show that food and eating topics were the primary context. Read Romans 14:2, 3, 6, 14, 15, 17, 20, 21, and 23. This would make Romans 14:5 and 6 about voluntary fast days that some were esteeming, with others not obligating themselves to those voluntary fast days. Did you catch it there? That's probably the better way to read the passage. And within the sometimes heated social setting of the first century Judaisms, of course, issues related to food, special days, and ritual purity were a natural flashpoint for friction between the merging of the Jewish culture and those from the nations who were grafted into remnant Israel. Read Romans 11:17 as well as Romans 15:5-7. So we've got to take that into account as well, is that yes, we're going to have some heated debates between the existing Jewish community and the Gentile communities that are coming in. So we can keep that debate among the fast days. We don't have to make it a debate about Sabbath versus Sunday, because I think that's a little too early to have that debate. Lastly, regardless of how one interprets Romans 14:5, we can be assured that Paul forbids the weak and the strong from judging and despising each other, since they constitute one viable community and are in need of one another. Read Romans 14:1-4, as well as verse 10 and verse 13. And that, in my opinion, is one of the single most important aspects about this particular study. Also, Paul definitely admonishes the strong to welcome Romans 14:1 and bear with the failings of the weak and accommodate their opinions, Romans 15:1, while each is to build the other up, Romans 15:2 and 7, and avoid destroying the work of God for the sake of food, Romans 14:2. That's also the strong emphasis that Paul's making in this particular passage. The kingdom of God is not about food, all right? Check out my podcasts, which are available on iTunes. You can search for me in the store under the search term Ariel HaNaviy. But if you prefer to watch your theology, check out my YouTube channel, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and click the bell for notifications. New content is added weekly or even daily.